There are a ton of great zooms and primes for wildlife, but which is better? Chelsea and I are going to walk you through the advantages and disadvantages of each. We're going to give you specific recommendations for your camera system, and we're even going to show you how to save maybe even thousands of dollars on great photography gear.
Thanks to KEH for sponsoring this video. KEH.com is a great place to buy used gear and make something like wildlife photography affordable. And on top of that, we have a coupon code down below where we can save you some money. They have a 180-day guarantee, and you can return your gear anytime within 14 days.
Thanks, KEH.
One obvious thing you have to consider about your wildlife lens is that you actually have to carry it. Zooms are more compact. If you're comparing a zoom and a prime lens of the same size, they're probably the same weight, but at least a zoom, you can zoom it down to a smaller size. You can probably fit it in a regular camera bag instead of needing your own separate camera case like a huge prime lens. So when it comes to carrying and being compact, I think the zooms are gonna win this one. What about actually using the lens? Which one is better then? Well, one thing I like about zooms, especially for beginners, is that it's far easier to find your subject in the frame. That sounds a little bit silly, but every time I hand my 600mm to someone, they can't find anything in the frame. It's great practice to be able to zoom back to 200mm, find your subject, practice at 300, practice at 400, practice at 500. Not only that, if you're really good at wildlife photography and you manage to get close to an animal, there is nothing more devastating than having a lens to telephoto to even get your subject in the frame. Zooms can solve that. Zoom back as far as you want, and suddenly you can fill the whole frame with your subject, even if you're very close. I like that versatility, so I'm gonna give the win to zooms once again.
Zooms are winning 2-1, so why is almost every pro using a big prime like this? Image quality. They're just sharper, and that makes a huge difference, especially with wildlife where you so frequently end up cropping really close because wildlife doesn't want to get close to you. Now, if you're really serious, you can often get really close, and in that case, you can produce good, usable, shareable results with just about any quality of lens. But the sharper primes mean that a higher percentage of the time when you go out, you're going to end up with usable results. It means you're going to have some shots that with a less sharp zoom, you wouldn't have been able to share. And that means that you're going to get more out of every hour that you put into the wildlife photography. Are zooms good enough? Yeah, they're often good enough. People make amazing shots with zooms, but if they had shot it with a nice big sharp prime, they would have looked just a little bit better. So this one goes to the primes. Big primes like this are also way more expensive, but the fact is this is a 2-generation-old 500mm f4, and you can buy a lens like this used on KEH for a lot less expensive than you would think. You don't have to spend $13K on a big new prime lens to get those same results. We tested this lens and it is just as sharp as the new lenses. Where they win is that they're smaller and lighter, so they're in general more usable, but the results from this one just as good as the new lenses. This is a 500mm f4 lens. It's a prime, and the fact is you cannot buy a 600mm f4 zoom. They do not exist. If you want a fast f4 lens like this, you just have to go prime. A lot of people tell you you don't need a fast lens for wildlife. After all, there's always so much background blur. You pretty much want more depth of field all the time. I could not disagree more. When you're in deep woods like this, you're always shooting in deep shadow. That means you're always going to be shooting with a higher ISO, especially when you have a shutter speed fast enough to freeze the movement of any animals. And that means you're going to have a bunch of noise, and noise is the enemy of detail. Not only does that fast aperture help you shoot at a lower ISO, reduce noise, improve detail, but it also lets you blur the background more, separating your subject from what can be very cluttered backgrounds when you're shooting in the woods. If you do get a faster lens, you can always shoot at a higher f-stop when you want to. It's just you're not required to. You have the option to blur the background when it's important. So the winner is primes for being able to use lower f-stops. Primes are 600, zooms are 600, so you might think they get the same reach, but here's the thing, the primes are sharp enough and fast enough that you can put teleconverters on them, and that brings you 40% closer. That's gonna make a huge difference in your photography.
But what about the price, Tony? Because you can almost always get a zoom lens for far less money than a prime. especially if you go to KEH. You use our coupon code in the description below where you can buy used gear that's been checked out. They look at everything, they make sure it's in working order. I mean, it seems like you just can't beat that.
Okay, but the zooms are cheaper because they're designed to be used by beginners. Pros use these big primes even though they're more expensive because they are better, right?
Okay, before we get into our lens recommendations, let's just do a quick recap. For carrying, the zoom wins. It's lighter, it's easier to carry, it's easier to travel with. For usability, the zoom wins again because it's easier to find your subjects. If you're just learning wildlife photography, way easier for you.
The primes have almost universally sharper image quality. They're also faster, which lets you blur the background more and use a lower ISO in just about any condition. And you can slap a teleconverter on there to get more reach out of them.
But the cost of the zooms, that's another place where they win. They're far more affordable. So if you're not shooting wildlife professionally and you don't want to invest in gear that's thousands and thousands of dollars, you can get a zoom lens for far less expensive and still get very good results.
Most people, their first lens should definitely be a zoom. And once you get to the point where you feel like, oh, I wish this were a little longer, a little sharper, that's when it's time to start thinking about a prime lens. Here are my lens recommendations based on having shot in the real world with like all of these different lenses. If you're on Canon and you want to zoom, your best bet is one of the Sigma lenses. You kind of get what you pay for. The Tamron 150 to 600 lenses are a little bit cheaper, but they're also a little bit worse. If you're looking for a prime, at the entry level, the Canon 400mm f/5.6 is old. It's more than a decade old, but get one used and they can be so great. They produce professional results on a decent budget. A step up from that is a used 500mm f/4 with a 1.4 Canon teleconverter. Be sure to get the Canon teleconverter. The other ones don't work great. I say get the 500 and not the 600 used because the 500 is light enough to hand hold. The old 600s, they produce great images, but they're very, very heavy. And if you have a massive budget, check out the new Canon 600mm f/4s. They're quite a bit lighter and they're absolutely amazing if you don't mind dropping $13K on a new one. If you're a Nikon shooter and you're looking at a zoom, definitely check out the Nikon 200 to 500. This is our favorite all-around wildlife zoom. We find it definitely in the real world outperforms the Sigma and Tamron 150 to 600. Some people are tricked because it doesn't go to 600mm, but it's a little bit sharper at 500mm than those lenses are at 600mm, even when you account for additional cropping. Plus, because it's a proper Nikon lens, it autofocuses way better, and that makes a big difference in wildlife photography. If you're looking at Nikon prime lenses, Nikon has a 500mm f/5.6 that's absolutely fantastic and at reasonable price point. You can also get used 500 and 600mm f/4 Nikons, put a 1.4 times teleconverter on them and get absolutely amazing results. If you're a Sony shooter and you want a wildlife zoom, get the 200 to 600 lens. It's absolutely amazing and it's like your only choice. If you want a prime in the Sony world, you don't have a lot of choices. They have a brand new, very expensive 600mm f/4. You can put a 1.4 teleconverter on there, or if you're shooting with the A9, you can put a 2 times teleconverter on there and get good results with it, but it's expensive. I'm sorry, I don't have less expensive suggestions for Sony. They don't have a lot of old used gear out there. They don't have previous generations, so you're kind of stuck. If you're in the Fuji world, your options are pretty limited too. The best you can do is the 100 to 400mm zoom. That's about it. And if you're shooting micro four thirds, the only lens that we've been really happy with for wildlife is the 300mm f/4. You can put a 1.4 times teleconverter on there. I would not bother with the 2 times teleconverter. When we tested it, we did not get sharper results by putting the 2 times teleconverter on there. If you found this video helpful, give me a like. If you want to see more like this, be sure to subscribe. And thank you to our sponsor, KEH. Check out the description where you can find a 5% off coupon. Anytime you go to buy any kind of gear, check out KEH. If you're thinking of upgrading, if you have stuff collecting dust in your closet, sell it all to KEH and get a bunch of cash. KEH can also fix your stuff if it's out of warranty. I promise it'll be less expensive than the manufacturer. Thanks, KEH.